Good afternoon and welcome back to the Triple Crown Wargaming Studio, where you're joining me again today for another episode of 20-0 Tactics. Today we're going to be focusing on cannon defence. So, what is cannon defence? Probably the easiest way to start today's video would be to go through what we mean by that. So, cannons are certainly one of the most sort of powerful and often complained about, if you like, units in 8th edition. Their laser accuracy and heavy hitting power is something that I think makes many players sort of quake in their boots when they see one deployed on the opposite side of the table. But never fear, there are things we can do to counter the cannon and to give ourselves the best chance of ensuring that our monsters or chariots or whatever other cannon susceptible units are going to go and deliver their job on the tabletop. Now, we call that cannon defence, if you like, and it's a suite of tactics that we'll be detailing today of things that you can do to either reduce the effectiveness of an opponent's cannon or actually simply stop it firing altogether. So, I'm going to break it down for you guys as follows. So today we're going to look at how you can place your models to best defend yourself from a cannon, how you can use sacrificial models to protect models you really care about, how you can block the cannonball being placed in the first place, how you can block the path of the sort of shot, and we'll talk about that very specifically. And then we're going to look at, with a certain types of cannons, we can do some tactics that I like to call boxing in. So I'm just going to take a moment to point out before we go through these tactics that obviously charging an enemy cannon, particularly very early in the game with a fast unit like chaff or cavalry or some sort of scout or skirmisher, is obviously the best way that we deal with cannons. It's obviously the ultimate in anti-cannon tactic. So I'm not going to go into that today. We're going to assume you just can't do that because your opponent is competent or because the table setup hasn't allowed it to be easily achieved. Because it wouldn't be much of a video if I say to you, charge the cannon, job done. So with that established and without further ado, I think we're going to start today by taking a look at how we place models. So let's start by taking a look at the tabletop. Okay, so we've got our table set up here. You can see we've got our dwarf cannon and we've got our Kemrian war sphinx. That's our monster we want to protect. So the first tactics that we can employ today are ones that we talk about the physical placement of our monster to help reduce or stop the cannon from operating. So there's a couple of things that we're going to look at to start with. So the first thing is if you have the opportunity to place your model behind impassable terrain, like this building, or something that's going to completely block the line of sight, then that is a far better deployment against that cannon than where we had him a few moments ago. Now I do want to point out that sort of rules as written, you often see people say, well, I can still shoot my cannon and if it bounces over the building, I can hit that monster and kill him. Yep, that's cool. But certainly in the Crown event pack, and certainly when you look at vast amount of events that you'll find sort of being played for Warhammer still, most people will FAQ or rule that you can't shoot at things that you can't see. So that's a really viable tactic for that very reason. Furthermore, if you hit the line of sight blocking terrain or the building, that actually prevents the cannonball from continuing. So if the bounce was even to fail to clear the building, if you were allowed to shoot over it, it would still be stopped by the building itself, which is illustrated actually quite nicely by the very large cannon-shaped hole we've got in this building here. So that's the first thing we're going to look at. Now there are other things you can use to help with that. If we didn't have an impassable building like this, we might decide to use an obstacle. So this would be traditionally a wall or a fence. Okay. So if we take a bit of a long pan this time, and see our dwarf cannon is going to fire at the Kemrian Sphinx behind the obstacle. Now, it's a little bit different with obstacles. If an obstacle is struck by a cannonball, the obstacle is destroyed and removed. Which, assuming it was hit, take it off and we'd have that clear movement. Now, the thing that's really crucial here is that obviously there's a very good chance, because you can see my Sphinx, that you could of course clear the obstacle, and that is true. But this is not a preventative tactic like putting it behind the line of sight blocking terrain was. This is a reduction in the effectiveness of a cannon. So obviously this is option A, this is option B. How we can actually go even further, assuming we had no terrain, take these off for a moment, we can look at the very way we place the Sphinx itself. Now, as we can see here, we've got the depth of the Sphinx's base, which is 100 mil. But the width of the Sphinx's base is actually only 50. So, if we turn him sideways, that cannonball now has a far smaller target to hit. And you'll see this a lot. You see it a lot in our battle reports, in our videos. You'll see it a lot, I imagine, in many games of Warhammer. Turning it sideways halves the depth of base that the cannon can strike. It's a huge advantage. And then when we start bringing the combinations together with, say, a piece of terrain like this, well, now the cannonball has got a good chance of hitting that. And even if it does clear, there's a good chance it'll overshoot the base here. So these are all methods that are going to stack up together to help increase your chance of preventing that cannonball being successful. Now, we've established some clear principles here with the way we've lined our models up, and that's going to be really important because we're going to use that as we move on to the next parts of the video. So we're going to reset the table, and we're going to take a look at how sacrificial models can help you when fighting against enemy cannons. Okay, so now we're taking a look at how sacrificial models work when fighting against a cannon. So as you can see, this time I've decided to deploy my Necropolis Knights in front of my Sphinx. And actually, I can go further, I can go one better, I can go back to what we just practiced, and I can turn my Sphinx sideways to mean that even if it does get all the way down that other base length, this one is even less likely to be hit. Now, what's crucial here is that we want to show the long length of the base of the sacrificial model to ensure that that's much more likely to be hit first, and the short edge of the base, if you like, the short depth of the model we're trying to keep alive, which in this case is our Kemrian War Sphinx. Okay, now this is probably the most common tactic you will see being deployed, if you like, to combat the cannon. So this only works with monstrous units. That's monstrous infantry, monstrous cavalry, monstrous beasts. So in this case, you can see here, other multi-wound models, they do not cut the mustard. They don't stop the ball. But what happens in this scenario is the cannonball is fired. For example, here, the overshoot lands here, and as a result, it's hit this Necropolis Knight first. What that means is that it's got to successfully wound and kill. It's got to take all of the wounds off of that Necropolis Knight before it can pass on to see if it strikes the Kemrian War Sphinx behind. And actually, we can look at this type of scenario here. We can make this even stronger by getting really tight to the back of the unit, and by placing them in this formation. They've got to kill two potentially now. They can't hit my Sphinx, and the chance of hitting these before they hit my Sphinx is pretty much guaranteed. As you can see, even if they do the classic, I'll go 10 from the back, well, they're actually bang on here. If they roll anything other than the 10, they're going to hit the Necro Serpents instead, or the Necropolis Knights. And obviously, if they hit both, it's even harder. They've got to kill both before they can get through to there. So that's fundamentally, very basically, how sacrificial model works. Very common. I use this lots myself with Crypt Horrors and Terrorgeists, and I'm sure anyone that's played me at an event using my vampire counts would definitely seen me do that against cannons. Okay, so we've established how we can place our figures. We've established what we can do with sacrificial models. So now we're going to move on to blocking the cannonball placement. So it's time for us to reset this table once again. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at blocking the cannonball placement. Now this tactic is based on the fact that a cannonball marker needs to be placed within line of sight of the cannon itself, meaning the cannon needs to be able to draw line of sight to the point you are placing the cannonball, or the model you are placing it on. So if you're firing at a model, they've got to be able to kind of see where they're planning on landing it. So we clarify this a little further in Triple Crown, and we say you've got to be able to actually see the spot that you're trying to chuck the ball on from the end of the sort of cannons. You've got to get down and be able to physically see it. So if we look at something like a Dwarf or Empire cannon, we can see we've got quite an array on the table here. I'm going to show you some ways that we can block the cannonball's placement by stopping the area being seen. So the first thing I might want to do is I might want to slide the Necropolis Knights forward a little bit. I'll move the fast cavalry up to here, and then I'll pivot my Sphinx, and I'll bring him across. Now, sure, there's going to be people telling me, oh, you've moved quite far, that Sphinx. That's fine. we're not too fussed today about the exact specifics of the movement values, we're just looking at a set of tactical options. So, now something like this is going to mean that when we bring the camera down to the sort of model's eye view, as it were, from this cannon, there's a lot of things actually impinging where the shot can land. You've got the dwarf longbeards here that are cutting off some of the line of sight. It's very hard to see a spot between all these figures that you can actually place the ball. So the likelihood, because I'm going to struggle to see, is that my enemy unit will be forced to place it much further forward. So here, where the bounce is much longer for it. If they do the old well 10 from the back, well actually that's going to land, about here, mate. So can you actually see that with all that obstruction in the way? Alternatively, you can turns be a bit more oblique when you do these types of tactics. For example, like this with the Sphinx. Now this makes it really tricky because you're actually cutting further down the amount of base that they can really physically sort of see and hit. So they might be able to get a nice line of sight, say, through to a spot like here to get their nice overshoot, but there isn't a lot of my base actually showing there. It's very difficult for them to see anything over here at all because there's this big blocked up unit in the way. Plus there's my Necro Serpents, plus there's this cavalry unit. If I was to, I could of course choose to reform these guys as well, because blocking those points of vision and vantage are really going to be important to ensuring that my cat survives. So again, all of these things that we're doing when we come back down, this is all about that model's eye view, all of the things we're doing here are about making it really hard to see a point on the table that is particularly favourable to fire this cannon at my Sphinx. Again, if I go somewhere like here, it becomes really difficult, and this actually is a lot easier to achieve than people think it's going to be. A big part of that is because they just don't get down and actually have a look. If you get down to the model's eye view, just say to your opponent, I just want to step round, I want to take a look what your cannon can see, what you can't see, and then you can place your units in a way that makes it much harder for them to be obstructed further. Okay? So, excuse me, this is a fantastic way to ensure that the sacrificial models, if you like, in this scenario, the Necropolis Knights, I'm not sure they're described as that very often, but they are in this scenario, are actually hit first, which again gives us back to the previous section where we're putting more pressure on your opponent's dice, and ultimately he's much more likely, or she's much more likely, to be unsuccessful in striking your actual cat or your monster or whatever you're trying to protect. Now, there's some other ways we can do this too, which are really, really cool. So we're going to slide some figures off and do this one a little bit on the hop, a little bit live, because I don't want to keep resetting sections, if you like. Turn that cat sideways again. Now we can see here, we'd love to just charge this cannon, but we can't because these longbeards are in the way. But because we're fast cavalry, and again flying units are very good at this, we can come around the sides and then we can make a reform at the end of that movement. There's lots of ways we might want to do this. We might just want to reform ourselves too wide like that. And again, if we bring the camera down to that model's eye view, all of a sudden it's much harder to actually see a point that we can shoot this cat comfortably. If we then was to say move our cat across here, we're making it even more difficult for you to physically be able to see a point that's favourable. It doesn't mean you can't see a favourable point. You'll definitely be able to see a point that you can shoot a cannon with here. But it's whether that point is much less likely to actually hit the monster. Okay? So, by being right in front of the cannon like this and clouding it, and if we could get 2 units of fast cavalry in there, we could make this even more of a nightmare for them. By doing that, what we're doing is making it much more difficult for the monster or the thing you're trying to protect to be struck by the bouncer or the overshoot of the cannonball. So, in summary for this section, blocking a cannonball placement is generally, I would see it as much more of a reduction than a prevention. There are times that because of the number of models on units on the table and things that you can intervene with, things like this, you can prevent completely with this, but it's much more useful to think of it as a reduction in the cannonball chance than in a prevention. So that's blocking the cannonball placement. Then we're going to move on to our fourth part, which is about path blocking, and I'll explain what that is in a bit more detail once we've reset the table again. It's time for us to take a look at path blocking. So this section of anti-cannon tactics, or cannon defence, is based on the fact that you cannot place a cannonball shot in a way where it might strike a friendly unit or units that are in combat. So we can see here at the moment, the cannon has got the ability to say, well, I can see the front edge of the base, or I can see the head of the cat, so I'm going to put the cannonball there and I'll take the shot. We don't like that. We're not a fan. So what we're going to do in our movement phase, and this is even easier if we've got flying monsters, is we're going to have a little walk around, little pivot, little walk around, little pivot. Now, obviously we're using quite a small board section, so you might wish, if we weren't, to give yourself a position whereby you could still get a charge, but we're using quite a small board section. Imagine this was much further away from the cannon in the first place. It might be a bit easier for you to see why we choose to do it like that, but the principles that we're going to talk about still remain the same. And by placing the monster between the enemy's cannon and an enemy unit, the cannon just simply can't be fired. It's complete prevention, because the only way it could be fired is if it was at the maximum extremity, which would mean that this back edge of the base would need to be 20 inches from the cannon. Now, I've got to be honest, even when you're at quite considerable distance, it's very rare that you've got that much space to actually do that. And if there's a chance whatsoever that the cannonballs bounce or overshoot might land on friendly units, you simply cannot place the cannon shot there. Similarly, if we reset the table like this, you can see our Sphinx is putting the cannon under a lot of pressure now. And it's our turn. So what we're going to do is we're going to decide that, so we started here, it's our turn. So we've been lucky so far, our cat's not been killed by the cannon, maybe he was turned on sideways or whatever, the cannon's moved to a more favourable position, a bit far away to charge. So what we're going to do is we'll move our cat to here. But before we do that, we'll declare a charge around Acropolis Knights. These guys will come in, crunch, just like that. And then we'll move our cat into a much more aggressive position. And because there's a combat going on here, the cannon simply cannot be fired again. You just can't fire it at that monster. So this is particularly nice to take advantage of when your opponent starts charging your units. Thinking they're on the front foot, thinking they're in the aggressive position. They charge your units, and you simply move your monsters or whatever you're trying to protect in behind the combat, between the combat and the cannon. And that prevents the shot being taken whatsoever. So it's really that simple, if I'm being honest with you. This is probably the most simple one in terms of guaranteeing your opponent just can't shoot his cannon. People really do miss it, and the amount of times you see people take the shot, because things like stone throwers, you can potentially hit your own troops and it's not a problem. With a cannon, it's very specific, it's very clear, you just can't do it. This is the solution to that problem. So that's a combat or that's friendly units. You'll put your monster or your unit you're trying to save from the cannon between that scenario and the cannon itself, and you just prevent the shots being taken. Or you might find they go, well, actually, I've got enough space. Obviously, we need a much bigger section than this. I can put the cannonball, 20 from the back of your base and hope that I roll a 10 for my overshoot and hope that I roll a big bounce and get you. And that's cool too, because that's almost certainly not going to work for them. They're not going to get the hit with the cannon they're looking for. In most scenarios, statistically, they shouldn't. So we're going to get the same result, which is that reduction, huge reduction in the efficiency and effectiveness of the opponent's cannon. Okay, so we've covered now all of the kind of tactics we would use against very standard cannons, if you like. That's the standard artillery piece that follows the rules for artillery presented in the main rulebook. Now, there are some cannons, for example, the Ogre Sky Cannon or the Skull Cannon of Khorne, that are mounted onto chariots or other type facings, if you like, that aren't a standard artillery piece. So we're going to look at our final anti-cannon tactic today, which is called boxing in, or as I'm affectionately calling it, boxing in, to show you what we can do to try and combat some things with them. Now, that's a set of tactics that are in addition to the 4 we've discussed already. So we're going to reset that table one final time, and we're going to go through that tactic now. Okay, so you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the table's set up quite differently right now. So we've got now one of the Ogre Sky Cannons here, or the Iron Blaster, as it's known. And this is a chariot-mounted cannon, which means that, unlike standard artillery pieces, it can't simply sort of pivot its way around nice and easy in the shooting phase. It has to do its turning to face its target, if you like, in the movement phase. Excuse me there. That's a big swallow. I'm not sure why. So it has to do that in the movement phase. Now, like a regular cannon, it still has to shoot a straight line from the end of the barrel. Okay, so we can see we'd love to charge it, but the iron guts are just very well placed. They're not going to allow me to do that very easily today. So we're going to have to come up with something else. What we're going to do is we're going to box it in. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to move some fast cavalry up to here. And we're going to choose then to move some fast cavalry up to here. Now, the final thing we're going to look. Move them back as far as they'll go. Okay. And again, we've got a third unit which we could use if we wanted to force it back some more, or we could use it to bring it in here. Like this, leave them sideways on to simply prevent the cannon doing what it wants. Then in the remainder of our movement phase, we're going to take our Sphinx. We're simply going to move them over here. And then we'll give them a little pivot at the end in case these iron guts want to cut up rough, if you will. It's a big charge for them. I'm sure I see the cameraman smiling at the phrase "cut up rough." So what's going on here? So fundamentally, this is still a chariot. It still has to obey the rules of Warhammer. It can't be within an inch of an enemy unit unless it's charging that unit or unless it's in combat. So, yeah, it could charge me here. It could charge my fast cavalry. And I would say, oh no, you charged my fast cavalry. This is a great horror show and terrible thing that's happened today. Because you're not cannoning my Sphinx, which is what this is all about. Okay. Similarly, he can't simply just roll himself back and pivot his way out of trouble because we've pinned him in, and if we wanted to cause him even more trouble there, we might have decided to. The table's a bit small for it. We might have decided to reform at the end of our movement into a nice little dart shape. Haven't really got the length of table to do that here today, but if we did that, for example, it'd give us a nice little dart, which. What we're doing is we're boxing him in. We're basically saying, look, there's only certain shapes that you can put your model in now. And those shapes do not allow this cannon, can't move in an inch, to get the shot away. Okay, now this only works against cannons that are mounted on chariots, and it also works against things like random movers, like steam tanks, providing that virtual pivoting is outlawed in the game that you're playing. Now, for something like the chariot, virtual pivoting doesn't actually apply to them. They still follow the normal rules for Warhammer. They pivot like a monster, like anything else. Virtual pivoting is something that applies very specifically to random movers. So, like the steam tank. But in this situation, the Iron Blaster's a bit stuck. He's very wedged in. He can't get himself back into a position where he can turn to fire his shot because he's pushing within an inch immediately. His best option is probably going to be to charge them and kill them. That doesn't matter because on our next turn we're going to declare our charge. Get in here, get a bit going on, and then we've got a good chance that we can put more pressure on him. Perhaps next turn we'll charge him with some of these fast cav ourselves as well, just to hold him up, to stop him shooting, to cause him trouble. Fundamentally, we're controlling the space that he can occupy, and it's very similar to some of the things we talked about in the 20-0 tactics on redirecting, but it applies really well to these types of chariot-mounted cannons that can't simply freely pivot in the same way that a regular piece of artillery can. So, we're going to summarise now. There are lots of tactics that you can employ to reduce the effectiveness of your enemy's cannons. Now, many of the tactics that we've discussed today aren't surefire hits. They're not going to guarantee every time your opponent just can't fire that cannon. But what they are going to do is reduce his chances. And the vast majority of them don't need to be used alone or in isolation. As you saw in a lot of the demonstrations we discussed today, we kept turning our monsters on sideways. We keep stacking the units together. So we've got sacrificial units, units blocking line of sight off. We can employ all of these tactics together, and as a suite, they make it really hard for your opponent's cannons to be anywhere near as effective as they might want them to be. So what we're saying is, in essence, that if you combine the tactics in the right way, you're giving yourself the best chance to nullify your opponent's artillery threat in the form of his cannons or her cannons. So that concludes today's episode of 20mm Tactics. I hope it's given you plenty of ideas to use in your next game, and please feel free to post your comments, send us an email, or go to all of the usual social media locations and let us know what you think about it, and if you think we've missed anything, or if there's some stuff you'd like to add that you think would be really helpful to yourself or the community. Don't forget, you can head back to the Night of the Realm mustering grounds to see all of our other content, and I'll see you next time on 20mm Tactics. Remember to tag your friends and like, subscribe and share today. What are you doing, mate?
I'm sharing.
It's not that sort of sharing, mate.
Oh. Head over to triplecrownwargaming.com and become a Knight of the Realm today.